Good morning, my friends. We are continuing with the Ananda way of life based on the guidelines for conduct of members of the Sevaka order. So let's start with a prayer. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, friend, beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, beloved Master Paramhansa Yogananda, saints of all religions, dearest friend Swami Kriyananda, humbly we bow to you all. Help us to live according to the highest that is within us. You have opened our eyes and inspired our hearts to see the path of self-realization. Now you must guide us and bless us with the clarity, the strength, and the courage to put one foot in front of the other, holding tightly to your hands until we find ourselves in thy home of eternal bliss. Om. Peace. Amen. We are in the last article, but we're still in the middle of it. It's Article 16. It's called the Ananda Ministry. And we have just been talking about yesterday and last week, we were talking about how a minister should use their discrimination in who they serve and how they serve. Not that we aren't committed to the whole world, but we also have to be practical in our idealism and use our energy in such a way that it will not be like riding on water or just pouring water into a leaky bucket. To find those individuals who are receptive and who are in tune and give as much as we can where it will be well received. There was the last sentence that I read yesterday, but I wanted to spend another moment on it. It is the ministers, they, who are sharing these teachings. And yesterday I also talked about, even though there is within Ananda a formally ordained clergy, nonetheless all of us have not only the capacity but a responsibility to share with those whom we meet who are receptive whatever we can of the teachings that we follow. We don't have to pretend to be more than we are, but we shouldn't hesitate to be who we are. And in that, Swami says, they should not hesitate to ask of others the commitment they themselves have made to the high ideals in which they believe. I said yesterday that I myself have had to work with this, and I'm still working with it. Because on one hand, we want to be able to build bridges. We want to be realistic in our expectations of others. We don't want to be trying to impose on people things for which they are not ready. But he puts it much more bluntly here, and this is partly yesterday I was talking about how very fearless and frank and total Swamiji is in what he says. He doesn't tone it down. So they should not hesitate to ask of others the commitment they themselves have made to the high ideals in which they believe. And there's lots of words in here. These are the high ideals in which we believe. So we want to invite others for the joy. That's what we have to understand. The freedom and the joy that's come from this kind of a commitment is not something that I want to say, oh, well, you can do it or not do it. It's all the same. We know perfectly well it's not all the same. That if you give yourself completely to this teaching with courage and trust in God, you will receive His grace. If you try to hedge your bet and play it halfway and maybe I'll do it a little and only when it suits me, well, the reward for doing that is you get a diminished return. Now, again, Swami was extraordinarily sensitive in how he dealt with people, so we're not counseling insensitivity, but he's wanting to be sure that we really believe in what we're doing, especially when he's talking now about ordained clergy, that we're not just saying, oh yeah, take it or leave it. This is a matter of life and death. This is a matter of joy or suffering. This is a matter of sooner or later, everyone is going to have to come to the understanding that God is the only answer. And what he's wanting us to do, I believe, with this statement, is to go deep into ourselves and root out any hesitation we have about the path for ourselves. And then we'll be able to stand strongly. It's come out in my life in lots of conversations with people, and it has to do with whether or not how much we fully and totally believe in what we're doing. And then comes the courage to express it. And then also comes the question of how sensitively we need to express it. But that sensitivity can never be a cover for our own lack of courage and commitment and unhesitating willingness to stand by what we know to be true. So I think I'm going to leave it at that point, but I really wanted to say something about it. Light bearers and ministers should make it a point, if possible, to conduct ceremonies or lead group meditations regularly. In other words, if we are ordained clergy, Swamiji says we should try to carry out our responsibilities. And if the world doesn't hand us on a silver platter the opportunity to do it, then we should exercise initiative and make ourselves available. And I think Swami is what also is working here. What Swami is working with also here is what I was just speaking of a moment ago. I do have something to offer. It's not I have something to offer, but I have something to offer, which is that this is my given responsibility, and I need to constantly looking for activities. And Swami is suggesting explicitly ministerial, spiritually oriented opportunities, not just the daily life that I might be living as an instrument and as a disciple, but also to be involved in explicit events that help deepen and uplift people's consciousness. And he suggests here, now bear in mind, all of this is written in the context of living in spiritual community. So when we start talking about the Ananda way of life, you might not have the opportunity to lead group meditations if you're the only people you know who's meditating, or you're just in such a place that it just can't happen because of the geography or whatever. But if you have a chance, he says, make it a point, if possible, to conduct ceremonies or lead group meditations regularly. And regularly is a good word, because that means it's a part of your life rhythm. It doesn't have to mean every week, but it just means it's something that is always part of what you're doing. So it's something to consider. Then he said, these ceremonies should be preferably, but not necessarily, performed in a chapel or church that has been dedicated in service to the divine ray which Ananda's line of masters have brought to earth. In other words, it's a very, I love the way he says that. He doesn't say an Ananda chapel or church. He says a chapel or church that have been dedicated in service to the divine ray which the Ananda line of masters have brought to earth. It's about as broad as he could say it. Preferably, he said, in some environment, and that would mean there would be an altar with our masters in front of it, that people coming into that space would expect to receive the Ananda expression of this divine ray. And he says, if such an environment not be available, the ceremonies may be performed in any suitable location, for their very performance is itself an act of dedication. And then he goes on, the purpose of this guideline then is to focalize divine services in an Ananda chapel or church or mandir where such exists, as an alternative to scattering their power loosely abroad. So he's making a point, but he's also wanting to broaden the point, because there are certain institutional imperatives. I'm not entirely familiar with them, but I have a sense of them, that certain Catholic ceremonies can only be performed in dedicated Catholic spaces. I believe I'm presenting that properly. And so that the physical place where you do it is also a requirement. And Swami's trying to, first he's starting with just common sense. Of course, if there is an Ananda chapel or church available, that would be the obvious place to have the purification ceremony, the light, the festival of light, a Sunday service, whatever it might be. If it's there, for heaven's sakes, let's use it. Let's not just sort of randomly, as he says, scatter our energy abroad. But it isn't the place that makes it holy. The ceremony itself creates a holy vibration around it, so therefore it can serve to uplift and energize any place where it takes place. So that's a positive. It's an easily arguable, observable positive. So Swami is trying to put the balance in here. Also because the Ananda ray, the ray of these masters, is ever expanding on this planet, and there's many individuals in many places who do not have, and may not have for a long time, the benefit of a dedicated Ananda space. But why then would we preclude them the opportunity to have these experiences, especially if individuals are traveling and you're somewhere where Ananda is not yet established, and your purpose in being there is to help establish Ananda? I use the word Ananda, but I want you to understand what I mean is the power of these masters. Why would you not want to do that? And this has come up in my life experience on a regular basis, because especially, well, I have done it all the time. I've often been in places where I was introducing people to this reality. And being just introducing them, there's no dedicated space. And one of the really powerful kriyas we did was in someone's living room, a rather chaotic living room. There was a altar to the masters. It was just a small gathering of people, but this is where they've done it. I've done kriya in a hotel room, somebody's private hotel room. Just gone into their hotel room, put the pictures of the masters there, because that was the way it was accessible. When I traveled with Swamiji in Europe back in like 1982, before Ananda itself had really established itself in Europe, Swami did Kriya all over the place, often in people's living rooms. I mean, Kriya service, which is a pretty, it's a pretty, you've gone through a lot of refining before you get to the point where a Kriya ceremony is being offered, but here was a group of people who were ready to take the Kriya. Swami had come from across the world to give it to them, and of course we were going to do it in that living room. It was done with respect and reverence and understanding of what we were doing, but the four walls around us, what difference did it make? What we were doing was not about the four walls, it was about the hearts and spirits that were being touched by it. However, if there is a church available or a chapel available that's suitable, by all means use it. So these are points that might not seem so important today, but we have countless institutional examples of how institutional definitions gradually begin to overtake spiritual realities. And so Swamiji is being very careful here to make sure that he at least has done his best to make the priorities clear. And then Swami, again, speaking about the Festival of Light particularly, it is perfectly permissible, on the other hand, to perform the Festival of Light in the chapel or meditation room of one's own home. Now, he's speaking specifically to ordained clergy, who, it is presumed, have a chapel or meditation room in their own home. That would be a pretty fundamental qualification. Back at the beginning of this, in an earlier article, it was stated, that all Ananda members of the Sevaka order will have dedicated spaces for their spiritual practices. So he's also saying this, you can do this privately, that we can bring this divine vibration into our lives. We can serve merely by performing the Festival of Light completely on our own. And in fact, from the beginning, when Swami created the Festival of Light, there was the public version, and then he had for the light bearer to perform entirely on their own. So all of those who are light bearers, whose opportunity to perform the festival in a public Ananda arena is not forthcoming, either extremely rare or in many cases simply non-existent, because there are more light bearers than there are opportunities to perform the festival on a weekly basis, then do it in your own meditation room. And I'm not sure, I being one of those who have always had a public forum fairly readily available to me, I've never had a lack of opportunities. But for those of us who do find ourselves in positions where that opportunity is not forthcoming, let us not lose track of from the beginning. Swami thought this is also a personal sadhana. I certainly have found tremendous personal benefit from reading and running through that festival as many times as I've been privileged to do it. And doing it in a personal way can have the same profound effect, because the meaning is in the blessing and the meaning is also in the words. So something very important to consider. Now, let me think. Oh, yes. I recently read a quote from St. Francis that I found extremely delightful. I'd heard it before, but I'd forgotten it. And it is, St. Francis said, preach the gospel at all times. If necessary, use words. Which is really putting the point on all of this, which is the responsibility of being a clergy person is to exemplify what it is that we're trying to share with others. And if we're constantly living that vibration in ourselves, then it's easy to share, because I'm sharing something I know and something I love with people I care about. And then it becomes effortless to do so. And the formal ordination or lack of it, the title or lack of it, the responsibilities, pastoral responsibilities or the lack of them, really don't have any bearing on my ability to preach the gospel, because it is what I breathe. It's the way I breathe, literally. And that's what matters, and that's what we work on. That's why, in fact, in the Ananda system, we don't have a seminary. At the present time, not exclusively, but largely, the ordained ministry is drawn from the Sevaka monastic order, which is to say that they're community residents. But the ordination is a recognition of a condition which already exists. The ordination does not create it, it merely confirms it, because it's the way we breathe. So, and all of us can breathe that way. And whether we're ever recognized externally or not is secondary to whether or not, because ministry is quite simply deep faith shared. And that requires no structure. So now Article 17, the community as home. I was commenting earlier this morning when I was looking at this, Swami never wastes a word. There's never a part of Swami's writing which is just fluff that you can just put aside. And whenever all these months now, more than a year and a half, that I've been picking up different writings of Swamiji and doing exactly what I'm doing here. I mean, shorter writings, not full-length books. I do full-length books in another context. I just, every so often, I think, oh, this is not an important part. And I'm always wrong. Just as simple as that. So the community is home. Somehow I just glanced at it and I thought it was lightweight. It isn't. So here we are. The community is home. Members should look upon Ananda as their spiritual family. Well, we have talked about that a lot, but the phrase spiritual family is really used a lot and it's worth considering. When you say someone is my family, there is an implication to that of the, well, the word that comes to mind is inescapability of it. You know, there's lots of definitions that people have of family. One is it's the place and the people who can't say no to you, who have to take you in, who can't shut the door. It's the place you can always go back to because it's where you belong and where you will be accepted. Now, for most people, the birth family, and of course, you know, they're bad birth families, bad meaning, as Master said, sometimes people are drawn together in the same family to fight it out in close quarters. That's the phrase he used. So aversion has as much magnetic power as attraction. So sometimes we are drawn together because we have difficult karma, not easy karma. But the concept of family, and the reason families are so important in human life, is because you can't, karma draws you into it and it has to be faced. You can't just deny it. Now, of course, people can transcend it and go into other directions, but you can't just cast it aside. As long as you have this body, you have this family. And at its best, it forces us into a kind of commitment that that enables us to grow spiritually in a powerful way. Because changing our consciousness is the point. And you can't always create harmony, you can't always create what you're trying to create, but you always have the opportunity to elevate your response until it becomes closer and closer to a divine response. Sometimes to elevate your response is to say, the way you treat me is completely inappropriate and I refuse to have anything more to do with you. And you may still be my biological family, but I'm not going to relate to you anymore. Spiritual family is we are together for the purpose of finding God. And we will be together. We will be bound together, not necessarily by personality affinity, and definitely not by physical definition, but because we are all disciples of the same Master. We are brothers and sisters in God. And it's as I've said several times here, it's a much, much bigger commitment than mere biology. Biology comes and goes. As soon as this body dies, everything that was defined by this body is gone. But death has no effect on our spiritual association. We are brothers and sisters in God. And we are eternally committed to each other's welfare. And relationships that are difficult cannot merely be escaped by death. They have to be faced into and resolved one way or another. Doesn't mean we become deep personal friends with everybody, but every challenge has to be faced and resolved. Not necessarily with each other. Sometimes proxies can step in. This needs to be said. If you resolve in yourself whatever the dissonance might be, you are not bound to wait until the other person resolves it. They can resolve it with somebody else who is standing in for whatever you represented. But once you are done, you're done. Otherwise, we would all have to be liberated at the same time. And that's not the way it works. But members should look upon Ananda as their spiritual family with everything, every bit of commitment that implies. They should treat community property as their own property. What that means is, in the same way that we protect and care for that which we feel belongs to me, we should look at everything that is part of Ananda and feel that on whatever level we can realistically express, I am also responsible for this. It's just saying, who am I? What does the word mine mean? And we broaden it to be that we are community members, not merely individuals living our own private lives. everything that I've read up until now confirms that. This is just summarizing it. They should consider the interests of the members as a whole as their own interests. That means the welfare, I have to think in terms of the welfare of all, not just what my own preference is. This sounds easier than it is, because we don't always agree. And I've had conversations with people when they become fixated on a certain point that they think is so important and they need to hold to it. And I know I've talked about this at great length earlier. Is it worth separating yourself from your spiritual family? I mean, it's in theory, it's possible that there's a principle or a belief that is the most important thing for you and you must live or die by it. But you have to ask yourself, compared to my relationship to my spiritual family, is this more important? And think about it like a biological family. Maybe some of your biological family has different views on climate change or ecology or politics or vaccinations, which is a big thing right now. Maybe they have difference of opinion. You know, are you willing to break the relationship with your brothers and your sisters on the basis of these beliefs? Well, it could happen, but is it really more important than the love ties that bind you? So, they should consider the interests of the members as a whole as their own interests. So these can be very subtle questions, when to give in, when to stand your ground. And he's using the word interest, not merely beliefs. If it's good for me, but it's not good for the community, if I have to take my advantage at the expense of my brothers and sisters in any way, or the expense of the good of Ananda as a whole, even if I have a right to this, you know, it's my property, it's my money, it's my energy, it's my project. But if I follow through on what's going to benefit me, is it going to hurt Ananda as a whole? Even if I'm right, even if I have a right, it's just, this Swami says, they should consider the interests of the members as a whole as their own interests. And this goes back to, we should not hesitate to encourage others to commit to the high ideals with the full commitment that we have committed. Even if other people say, but my interests, I want them. Well, it's not unreasonable of us to expect that we will consider the interests of all of Ananda as equal to our own personal interests. So these are not small questions that Swami's, small requests that Swami's putting in front of us as members of the Ananda Sevaka order. This is a monastic order, bear in mind. Even though the outward appearance of it is a continuation of ordinary life, this is a monastic order. And in a monastic order, the interests of the whole community have to be considered, not just my own. And they should view Ananda as their own true spiritual home. In other words, we may have had a biological family. We may have had something that we loved before. We may have had a country. We may have had a place. But now all of that is behind us. This is a monastic order. And it helps us at times to hold the image of what if I was a nun or a monk, you know, some centuries ago, and I walked in that door of that monastery and that door closed behind me. And we all know what that was about. Now, of course, this is Dwapara Yuga. Things are a little bit different now. But on the inner level of re-identifying, redefining, making this our reality. This is our lasting reality. Everything else is temporary. So he says unequivocally, they should view Ananda as their own true spiritual home. They should consider the interests of the members as a whole as their own interests. They should treat community property as their own property. They should look upon Ananda as their spiritual family. Of course, you can always water it down. You can always justify watering it down. But why would we want to? these are lifelong questions. These are not like, oh yeah, I know that one. No, no, no. This comes back again and again. And each time we have the opportunity to ask ourselves one more time, what does it mean now? And how deep can I go into this? God bless you, my friends.